coming home always felt strange. It wasn't that I didn't love the town, it was just small, familiar, predictable. After a semester of long nights and lectures, I had hoped for something more exciting. John's house stood at the end of the street, draped in Christmas lights that blinked in perfect rhythm. The faint hum of laughter and music spilled out when I pushed the door open, stepping into the warmth of the holiday gathering. "Cody," John's voice boomed over the chatter. He pulled me into a quick hug, his excitement contagious. "Finally, it's been forever. Grab some food, drinks, whatever you want." I didn't get a chance to respond before his attention darted to someone else. Typical John, always the host. That's when I saw him, Mr. Eric. He stood by the kitchen counter, laughing softly at something someone had said. Dark hair streaked with gray, tall and composed, he looked nothing like the stressed, overworked dad I remembered. There was an ease about him now, a warmth that filled the room in a way the decorations couldn't. My chest tightened, and I looked away, hoping to ground myself. He wasn't supposed to look like that. "Cody," Mr. Eric's voice cut through my thoughts as he walked toward me, hand outstretched. "It's been a while." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, a while." Up close, the pull was undeniable. His smile was calm but magnetic, his gaze lingering just a second too long. And in that moment, I know I was in trouble. The noise in the living room grew louder as more people arrived, the clatter of glasses and laughter blending into a chaotic symphony. I needed a break. Wandering into the kitchen, I found Mr. Eric alone, his back turned as he sliced into a loaf of fresh bread. "Need help?" I asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. He glanced over his shoulder, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "If you're offering, I won't say no." I stepped closer, grabbing a knife from the counter. The scent of cinnamon and roasted chestnuts filled the air, but my focus was on the man next to me. "It's been a while since I've done this," Mr. Eric said, his voice low but warm. "Cooking?" I teased, trying to keep it light. "Christmas," he replied, pausing for a moment. "First one since the divorce." His words hung in the air, soft but heavy. I glanced at him, unsure of what to say. There was a quiet vulnerability in his tone, something raw and unguarded that tugged at me in a way I couldn't explain. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "That must be hard." He shrugged, the knife still in his hand. "It is, but it's also a fresh start. Just takes some getting used to." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard, and before I could think, I said, "You're handling it pretty well." He chuckled softly, the sound rich and genuine. "Thanks, Cody. That means a lot." We worked side by side, arranging platters and slicing fruit. At one point, I reached for a bowl at the time he did, our hands brushing. It was nothing, just a moment, but it felt like more. "You've got a knack for this," Mr. Eric said, his smile easy but his eyes lingering. "It's not rocket science," I joked, though my pulse quickened. Before I could process what was happening, John burst into the kitchen, a tray of empty glasses in his hands. "Hey, what are you two plotting in here?" he asked, grinning. "Just trying to make this party less of a disaster," Mr. Eric replied smoothly, turning his attention back to the counter. But as John laughed and rattled off something about needing more ice, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed some invisible line. And yet, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. In the living room, while setting up the tree, he handed me an ornamented delicate glass angel and our fingers brushed. In the garage, we found ourselves untangling a mess of Christmas lights, laughing as I ended up more tangled than the wires. It was always something, always him. The more we talked, the harder it became to ignore the pull. Mr. Eric wasn't just kind, he was insightful, funny, easy to talk to. We bonded over the little things, a shared love of old holiday movies, the same distaste for overly sweet eggnog, and an unspoken understanding of what it meant to feel out of place during the holidays. But guilt gnawed at me. This was John's dad. Every time I caught myself staring too long or leaning too close, I reminded myself that this was dangerous territory. Still, There was something about Mr. Eric's presence that made it impossible to walk away. One evening, as the first flakes of a snowstorm began to fall, Mr. Eric appeared in the doorway of the living room. "John says you're heading home. Let me give you a ride, it's getting bad out there," he offered, keys already in hand. I hesitated but nodded. The idea of being alone with him felt reckless, but I couldn't say no. The car was quiet as we drove, snow falling thick and fast against the windshield. The heater hummed softly, filling the space with warmth. Mr. Eric's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles brushing against the sleeve of his sweater. "You don't talk much in the car," he said, glancing at me with a small smile. "Guess I'm just taking it all in," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded, his gaze returning to the road. "It's peaceful, isn't it? The snow, I mean. Makes everything feel softer." I looked at him, the soft light from the dashboard highlighting the curve of his jaw. "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was talking about the snow anymore. The silence stretched, heavy with something unspoken. At a stoplight, he turned to me. "Cody, I..." The words hung in the air, unfinished. He leaned closer, just a fraction, and I felt the pull again, intense, undeniable. My breath caught, and for a moment, I thought he might actually kiss me. The light turned green, and he pulled back, his jaw tightening as he focused on the road again. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive. When we reached my place, he hesitated, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. "Good night, Cody," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. I stepped out into the cold, the snow biting at my skin, but it couldn't compete with the heat still lingering in my chest. The holiday party was in full swing, a sea of laughter and Christmas carols echoing through the house. Every corner glimmered with decorations, and the scent of mulled wine mingled with freshly baked cookies. I tried to keep my focus on the festivities, but my thoughts kept drifting to Mr. Eric. I spotted him near the patio door, looking out into the snow-covered yard. His silhouette was framed by soft light, and something about his stance seemed different. He looked conflicted, distant. Before I could talk myself out of it, my feet carried me across the room. "Hey," I said, my voice low enough that no one else could hear. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine for a moment before he nodded toward the hallway. "Can we talk?" I followed him into the quiet, leaving behind the clinking glasses and cheerful chatter. We stopped in the den, a room filled with shelves of books and a crackling fireplace. He closed the door behind us, the weight of his gaze settling on me. "I've been trying to ignore this," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't. Cody, there's something about you that's..." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "It's not just me, is it?" The question hung in the air, heavy and fragile. My throat tightened, and I couldn't bring myself to look away. "No," I admitted, the word slipping out before I could stop it. His shoulders sagged, as though he'd been holding his breath. "This shouldn't be happening," he said, his tone conflicted. "You're John's best friend. This could ruin everything," I finished for him, my voice shaking. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire. "But I can't stop thinking about you," he said finally, his words breaking the silence like a floodgate opening. "I don't know what to do with this, Cody." I stepped closer, the space between us shrinking until I could feel the heat radiating from him. My heart pounded in my chest, and I opened my mouth to respond. The door burst open. "Hey, what's going on in here?" John's voice shattered the moment, his face a mixture of confusion and casual curiosity. I jumped back, my pulse racing. Mr. Eric turned to him, his expression carefully neutral. "Just talking about the decorations," Mr. Eric said smoothly, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. John laughed, oblivious. "Well, come on. Everyone's asking where you disappeared to." He left as quickly as he'd come, leaving the door ajar. I looked at Mr. Eric, the unspoken words still hanging between us. "We can't do this," he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor. But the way he lingered, the way his eyes found mine again before he walked away, told me this wasn't over. The morning light filtered through the curtains, pale and cold. I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. John's interruption had been a relief and a curse. It saved me from saying something I wasn't sure I was ready to admit, but it also left everything unresolved. By mid-afternoon, John called me into the living room. I hesitated at the doorway when I saw Mr. Eric sitting there, his face calm but serious. John looked up, his brows furrowed in confusion. "What's going on?" John asked, glancing between us. Mr. Eric cleared his throat, his voice steady but low. "John, I need to talk to you about something. It's about Cody." My stomach dropped. The room seemed to shrink, the silence louder than anything I'd ever heard. John leaned forward, his confusion turning into something sharper. "What about Cody?" he asked, his tone cautious. Mr. Eric glanced at me before turning back to his son. "I have feelings for him. I know it's unexpected, and I understand if you're upset, but I couldn't keep this from you." The words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. My heart pounded, waiting for John to respond. For a moment, he just stared, his jaw tight. "You're serious," he finally said, his voice clipped. "Yes," Mr. Eric said simply. John leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I don't even know what to say," he muttered. Mr. Eric sighed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I didn't plan this, John. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. And Cody, he means something to me." The room felt like it might explode from the tension. I braced myself for anger, but instead, John stood and walked to the window. He stared out at the snow for what felt like forever before speaking. "You really care about him?" he asked, his back still to us. "Yes," Mr. Eric said firmly. John turned, his expression softer now, though still guarded. "I don't get it, but if it makes you happy, I'll try." The weight in the room lifted slightly, though the air still felt heavy. Mr. Eric nodded, his gratitude evident, and John gave me a tight smile before leaving the room. Later that evening, the Christmas lights cast a warm glow over the house. Mr. Eric and I found ourselves alone again, standing near the mistletoe hanging in the doorway. The festive hum of carols drifted in from the other room, but the world felt quiet in that moment. Mr. Eric stepped closer, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Are you sure about this?" he asked softly. Instead of answering, I closed the gap between us. His lips were warm, soft, and everything I hadn't allowed myself to want until now. For the first time all week, everything felt right. Christmas morning arrived with a quiet serenity. The snow outside sparkled under the pale winter sun, and the house smelled of cinnamon and freshly brewed coffee. I sat on the couch, cradling a steaming mug, watching John sort through a pile of wrapped gifts under the tree. Mr. Eric entered the room, his presence instantly grounding me. He carried a tray of pastries and set them on the table, offering a quick smile before sitting beside me. John looked up, catching the exchange, and sighed dramatically. "You two are so obvious, you know that?" Heat rushed to my face, but Mr. Eric chuckled, shaking his head. "Subtlety isn't exactly our strong suit, is it?" John rolled his eyes, but there was no edge to it. "I'm still getting used to this," he admitted, glancing at us. "But if it's what makes you both happy, I'm not going to stand in the way." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I hadn't expected it to feel this easy, this normal, but in that moment, it was. Mr. Eric leaned back, his arm brushing mine. "Thank you, John. That means a lot," John smirked. "Just don't get all mushy on me. I draw the line at PDA during Christmas breakfast." We all laughed, the tension that had lingered for days finally dissipating. The awkwardness wasn't gone completely, but it felt manageable, like something we could navigate together. As the morning went on, we opened gifts, ate too many pastries, and shared stories from years past. It wasn't perfect, but it felt right, honest, real. At one point, Mr. Eric caught my eye across the room. His expression was soft, filled with a quiet kind of happiness I hadn't seen before. I smiled back, knowing this was just the beginning. Love doesn't follow rules or wait for the perfect moment. It sneaks up on you, challenges you, and, if you're lucky, makes everything worth it. And as the three of us sat together, surrounded by the warmth of the season, I knew we'd figure it out. If you like my journey of acceptance to whom I am, then like and subscribe to my channel. We are Pride Stories Unfiltered, your #1 pride.